This is an extra section that I put in there. This is knowing some basic numbers for aerobic exercise, and then some training adaptations as well. I went over this in the lecture class, so I wanted to put it together so I could test you guys on it and for it to be there for the rest of the students as well. Okay, so some basic information to know. Generally, the rule of thumb is you expend about 100 calories per mile. So I decided to do some math to see how does this actually work for me. I always believe that you should create a point of reference for yourself, and then you can adjust things accordingly. So for me, if I ran a mile, I could run a mile easily in 10 minutes. That would be a 6 mile per hour pace. It really doesn't matter how fast you run the mile, because if you run it faster, then you're just running for a shorter period of time. So that 6 miles an hour creates numbers that are easy to work with, so that's what I went with. My weight is 183, give or take. So I take my weight, 183, divided by 2.2. That gives me my weight in kilograms. I multiply that by 35 mLs per kg per minute. That's the VO2 for running at 6 miles an hour. And I multiply those together, and I get a value of 2,911 milliliters of oxygen per minute. So that's the total volume of oxygen I consume per minute running at that speed. So I divided that number by 200, which goes back to the metabolic equations, and I get 14.5 kilocalories. So that's 14.5 kilocalories per minute. And then I'm running for 10 minutes, so I multiply the 14.5 times 10, get 145 kcal. So if I run a mile, then it's about 145 kilocalories. So the 100 kilocalories per mile is a little low, but it gives you a basic number to work off of. So just kind of keep that in mind. So your caloric expenditure is going to differ. So you figure it out for yourself, and then figure out, okay, is the person I'm working with, are they bigger than me? Are they smaller than me? What's going on? So I put in there, if you're a 120-pound individual, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, but for most guys, they're going to weigh more, so I just said it was female. And for her, if you do the same math, it's about 95 kilocalories per mile. So you're looking at, again, that 100 calories works well for that segment of the population that is in the 120 pounds, a little bit more than 120 pound, 126 pounds. You know, it works for those individuals. 150 calories per minute would work for somebody that's 188 pounds. So you're getting some rough estimates of what these values should be. So if you run a 5K, 3.1 miles, you could go with the 100 calories. Then that value would be around 300 calories that it would take to run 3.1 miles or a 5K. And you figure, okay, it basically takes 30 minutes to run a 5K for many individuals. So to expend 300 calories in 30 minutes is fairly reasonable. For me, it'll take basically 450 calories to expend to run a 5K, and a range of anywhere from 300 up to about 500. If you expend 500 calories running a 5K, then you weigh about 209 pounds. So you're getting an idea. These are rough estimates. What you're trying to get at is reasonable numbers. So if the person's saying, I burned 2,000 calories running a 5K, you know that number just doesn't make sense. They made an error somewhere. Oops. So additionally, stored calories. These are numbers and values that they all kind of work together, again, to try to figure out some things that are reasonable. So roughly, you have about 2,000 kilocalories of stored carbohydrate, mostly glycogen in the muscles, some in the liver. You have some blood glucose that's technically not glycogen, but you have carbohydrates stored in the blood. Those numbers are relatively low. So, you know, you look at a 5K, you're expending 300 to 500 calories. you're never going to run into a problem of running out of stored energy running a 5K under normal situations, under normal circumstances. You have a relatively limitless number of fat calories. Again, I decided, okay, I'll use myself as a reference point. So I weigh 183. When I had my body fat measured with the bod pod quite a few years ago, I was about 18%, but I weigh about the same as I did then, so I would figure that number is probably pretty consistent. When I multiply that out, I get 33 pounds of fat, which is, it seems high, but actually that number, judging by that information, is fairly reasonable. I mean, I'm a fairly skinny dude, so even for someone like myself, if you multiply the 33 times 3,500 calories per pound of fat, even for someone like me, I have 115,000 calories of stored fat. There's no activity that I'm going to do that's going to use 115,000 calories of stored fat. So, that fat source is basically limitless. And when you look at prolonged distance activities, you have the Ironman triathlon, which is going to be happening or happened this past weekend, or this upcoming weekend, or this past weekend, because you'll see this after the event. In those sorts of instances, you're going to expend a lot of calories. You have the potential to run out of stored carbohydrate calories, and that's why individuals will eat or consume carbohydrates to a certain extent during the activities. That's where you can potentially run into problems. If you run a marathon, the number of calories is going to be less. So you're not going to be really running into trouble. And you don't see people running into trouble with the marathons even. They could have other problems that they run into, but running out of calories is really unlikely to be a problem. And then if you take it to the extremes, there's the eco challenges, which are multi-day events that are outside, covering adventure racing, that sort of stuff. Those people are out there potentially for multiple days. You're going to expend a lot of calories, and you need to eat some food. But as far as fat calories are concerned, you still have a ton of energy that's available. I throw these other things into it. They go into the equation, but they really have a very limited effect. You have protein. I don't know how many calories you have in stored protein, but they're not particularly used during exercise. They're used during prolonged, higher intensity exercise, exhaustive types of exercise. So there's a potential out there that you could use protein as an energy source. But for the most part, when you're doing a standard exercise routine, it's unlikely. You also have creatine. It's used for burst type activity. The supply is extremely low, so you have it for seconds. If you're doing a sprint, if you're doing push-ups or something like that, resistance training, you'll use creatine as part of your energy sources, but the source is extremely low. But theoretically, it is a source of energy. So hitting the wall. Hitting the wall is probably not the best term for this, but what I wanted to kind of look at and mention to you is, what are the reasons why people will fatigue during an aerobic event? Why are people not able to continue the exercise, and they say, I just can't go anymore, I'm done. So most common reason is a buildup of lactic acid. You are not able to clear the lactic acid. Lactic acid is broken down into lactate fairly quickly. The body wants to buffer lactic acid. You buffer lactic acid with bicarbonate, and fairly quickly it becomes a salt, which is lactate. In the general public, and these terms are used interchangeably, that's fine for the most part. There is a little bit of a nuanced difference there, and if you're a biochemist, then that difference is, you notice that difference and whatever, but generally most people will use those terms interchangeably, and for the most part that's okay. But the reason why we fatigue is we cannot clear the lactate fast enough. We can't buffer the lactic acid fast enough. it builds up, and when it builds up, it impairs aspects of the sliding filament theory. You remember that from exercise phys? So it impairs part of the sliding filament theory, and that's going to impair muscle contraction. So that's probably the most common reason. So if you're doing a relatively short distance event and you can't go any further, it's probably a buildup of lactic acid and lactate. You have the issue of dehydration. Again, if you're out there for an extended period of time outside in the heat, you have that risk of losing fluid as well as losing electrolytes, salt. That's also a common reason why people will run into trouble. And then lastly, you can run out of carbohydrates theoretically. I think it's, oftentimes it's going to be hard to tease out, is the person dehydrated or are they running out of carbohydrates? Because the events kind of lend themselves to either of them being the issue. If you're playing a football game and you see somebody cramping up, then that's more likely to be an issue of dehydration. If you see an Ironman triathlon, then it could be it could be dehydration, and that's what's causing them to run into trouble, or it could be running out of carbohydrates. It's going to be hard to kind of tease it out to a certain extent, but a beverage like Gatorade is doing both. It's addressing rehydration, it's giving you electrolytes, it's supplying you with a level of carbohydrates, so it's kind of taking care of all of that, and that's why it's recommended for those types of events. So it's possible to run out of carbohydrates, but it's unlikely. You use fat and carbohydrate as an energy source during aerobic events. You're never going to use pure fat, never really going to use pure carbohydrate. It's going to be some mix of those two. Usually, if you're doing low intensity exercise, it's a 50-50 split. If you're doing higher intensity exercise, it may, and in the literature or in an exercise physiology textbook, they may say 100% use of carbohydrates. That's a proportion. So you're still using fat as an energy source, but the fat metabolism is just not fast enough. So you're using more and more carbohydrate in proportion compared to fat. And they'll say 100%, but really it's a continuum that's going on. There'll still be some fat metabolism going on, but it's just so much more is carbohydrate. Also realize, I'm not going to ask questions about biochemistry on the exam, but it's all a continuum. It's not a switch. So you don't switch from fat metabolism to carbohydrate metabolism. You don't switch from carbohydrate metabolism to fat metabolism. You've got all those going on at the same time. It's just the proportion of one to the other. Excuse me. You consume food and beverages with carbs during long distance events, and that's fairly common to see that. So you want to put all these things together. So use logic and use things that you know. You do the labs. Use yourself as a point of reference. Remember your numbers for you. To the heck with everybody else. Know your numbers. So if you know your numbers, then you can base things up or down based on the person that you're working with, or the exam question says a 150-pound individual. What's a reasonable caloric expenditure for that person? And you're like, well, I weigh 120 pounds. I weigh 180 pounds. I weigh 200 pounds. So you just work up or down from that. You have the 100 calories per mile. Work off these numbers that you know, and especially work off the numbers that refer to you, and then you can kind of adjust things up or down accordingly. The considerations: weight, your fitness level, intensity of the activity, the mode, was it aerobic activity or strength activity? So oftentimes the things you do are difficult to quantify. If you relate it back, and it might get better in the future with the different fitness apps and the different watches, the Apple Watch, the iWatch, the various Garmin, whatever things that are out there. It may be easier to figure out how many calories you're expending. I will say, if you're using like a Polar heart rate monitor, at least the ones in the past, they would just measure heart rate. So if you don't know what the fitness level of the individual is, they probably ask you what your weight was. So that's helpful, but they don't really know your fitness level. So if you're somebody that's very fit, that caloric expenditure might be greater. If you're low fit, it might be less. There were definitely gaps in figuring out that caloric expenditure. When you use a fitness tracker, again, it's not figuring out what exactly the activity is that you're doing. It'll give you a number, and that number is probably a decent estimate, but it's not going to be very precise. And that's what you need to do as well, is you need to figure out an estimate. It might not be perfect, but it should at least be in the ballpark and give people, I'm twitching, and give people an idea of what the values are. So, 300 to 500, it's a reasonable number for 30 minutes of activity. Significant deviation up or down. Are you a heavyweight wrestler that's in shape and can run? So you're 200, 250 pounds. We have some football players that are heavy, over 200 pounds, that are in relatively good shape, and they can run and they can exercise at a high intensity. They will burn a lot of calories. Are you 6'6" or are you 4'10"? If you're taller, you're going to weigh more, and then your caloric expenditure is going to be greater. Is the person very fit, low fit? Are you able to run at 10 miles an hour, or are you only able to walk at 3.5 miles per hour and maybe 5% grade, or maybe 3.5 miles per hour and you're walking flat? It's going to take a long time. What I see for some of the data for you guys is oftentimes for the girls, with the exercise intensity and weight and all that, it could easily come out to it taking about an hour, give or take, to expend 500 calories. Whereas for some of the men, they could expend 500 calories in half that time, so in 30 minutes. So when you're looking at weight loss and caloric expenditure, it's just simple math. The guys can really churn out and burn calories, and we see that with weight loss, that men are better able to lose weight with just exercise alone. Women, definitely diet restriction, but in general, we want dietary restrictions, dietary adjustments for everybody. But you definitely see it's easier for men, and the men are oftentimes burning many more calories than the women, and that's just a matter of testosterone and muscle, and the exercise intensity you could exercise at. Okay, come on. No, don't end show. Okay. So unreasonable values or questionable values. This is a big thing that I harp on, and I think it's very, very important. And it's very important from a practical perspective. When you're talking to somebody and you say something that just doesn't make any sense, then people look at you a little bit differently, like this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And then you kind of go down a road where they don't. You go down a road you don't want to go down. What you want is for people to look at you as a source of knowledge and look at you as being knowledgeable. And in order to do that, oftentimes you have to say, I don't know what the answer is. People respect that, as well as being able to say things with a level of confidence. And when you can't say it with a level of confidence, to say that you don't know is better than to give a value or an answer that just doesn't make any sense. So I provided some examples. I look like I put one twice. Okay, so I can expend 2,000 calories in 45 minutes. That's just impossible. Just impossible. Doesn't make any sense. I put this in the beginning, and then I wanted to add it back in, and I didn't realize I already did. But I can run a mile in 5 minutes. Are you a super lean elite runner? Did you run cross country in high school? What's going on with you? Most people are not going to be able to run a mile in 5 minutes, 12 miles an hour. It's just very, very unlikely. Some people can, but you got to look at that person and say, does that make sense? So yeah, if you look at me, it's probably hard to tell. If I took my shirt off, it would be pretty obvious that I'm not somebody that could run a 5 minute mile. If I took my shirt off, which I'm not going to do, but if I did, and you looked at me and I was ripped and shredded and obviously very low body fat percentage, then maybe. I would definitely ask the person some more questions. And when you deal with some of these instances, asking more questions is good. I do that from students all the time to try to figure out what's going on. And sometimes they give me answers that will validate or invalidate the response. So if I ask a question, you ran that in under a mile under 5 minutes, and then the next question I would ask is, did you run cross country in high school? And if they say yeah, and my best time was a 4:45 mile, I say okay, maybe this is all coming together. If they say no, I never ran, I'm okay. But other people, when I run with other people are running faster than me, then that number is probably not right. I can run 10 miles in 90 minutes and expend 1,500 calories. That I used to be able to do that. I don't know if I could do that now, but that's fairly reasonable. But you have to, again, ask some more questions. Are you a decent, good male runner? Or female, but the female is going to be much, much more unlikely because of the weight issue. So the females, if she's a good runner, that's great. She may be a much faster runner than what's listed here. So running the 10 miles in 90 minutes, many women are going to be able to do that. That's not that big a deal. But the expending of 1,500 calories for that female is much more unlikely, just because the body weight is probably going to be significantly less. And for me, I forget, I was probably I was probably in the 170s, 180s when I was doing that, and I may have run it even a little bit quicker. So it might have been more like 11 miles in that 90 minutes to expend the 1,500 calories. And if you're running 10 miles in 90 minutes, you're running at 6.7 miles per hour. Again, you look at that speed, it's fairly reasonable for a lot of people. Not everybody, but it's reasonable for a lot of people. So you got to ask a couple extra questions. Expending 500 calories in 15 minutes versus expending 500 calories in 50 minutes. So saying 15 versus 50, sometimes it's hard to hear the difference in what somebody's saying. 15 doesn't make any sense. 50 is very reasonable, and you just have to look at the person and again ask a couple other questions to see if it's kind of falling into line. Okay, VO2. Look at normative values. I'm not going to break down each individual values, but some basic categories you do need to know. So if you are super elite, you have a VO2 in the 80s, high 70s for the men. For the women, it's going to be the high 60s and the 70s for the women. And these are the individuals that are going to win races or be highly competitive at those VO2s. They usually look emaciated. They're going to need to eat something is the way they look. But if somebody's saying, oh, I'm an elite individual, what's their VO2? For elite at the collegiate level, I'd say the men are in the 70s and the women are in the 60s. And you'll see people in the general population that have those sorts of VO2s. You'll see men that have VO2s in the high 60s. That's not all that uncommon. Seeing women to have VO2s in the high 50s, in the 60s, that's not all that uncommon. So you kind of figure it out and ask some questions to figure out if it's reasonable. For a typical male runner, I'd say the VO2s are in the 50s, low 60s. So again, it's taking it a notch lower. For the females, you're looking at the 40s and the 50s. These are good, but kind of average at the good level runners. People that run on a regular basis, people like me that are not setting the world on fire. They can run, and they can run well. They can run marathons and they can run races. but they're not anywhere. They're not winning. They're not, they're looking for achieving a personal record, a personal best, and that's really what they're trying to achieve. Not they know they have no shot at winning anything. Low VO2 is associated with increased risk of disease. Heart disease is there's been studies to show that less than 35 or 10 METs. Other studies will show more that less than 35 mLs per kg per minute for men and around 30 mLs per kg per minute for women. So in other words, for men, you should be able to run a 10-minute mile. Every male should be able to run a 10-minute mile. I realize a lot of men can't, but they should be able to. And women should basically be able to run a 12-minute mile. So you're running at 5 miles per hour, 8.5 METs. That should be something, if you train and work at it and your weight is reasonable, that's something that is fairly easy to achieve and can really be a goal for men and women, especially middle-aged men and women, to try to achieve. And if you're an average individual that's been sedentary, maybe you put on a little bit of weight, to achieve these numbers is doable. To try to get to a high VO2, something in the 50s or the 60s, that may not be reasonable, especially as you get older. But to be able to run a 12-minute mile for a woman, a 10-minute mile, that's fairly doable for a large segment of the population. And make sure, so basically what the take-home message from this would be, when I looked at your VO2 data, most of the people had VO2s kind of above these levels. The key is try to maintain what you have. If you maintain what you have, you'll be good. Typically, VO2 goes down a little bit. I did a VO2 max test the other day, and the value that I achieved was 7.2 miles an hour, and I did 1 minute at the 7.5% grade. When I was in graduate school, I would be able to run at 7 miles per hour. It was a little different protocol, and I could reach 10% grade. I was in a lot better shape in college, graduate school, but my decrease in fitness is significant. I'm not as fit as I used to be, but I'm maintaining. My fitness level hasn't dropped off that terribly, and that's what you should be trying to do. The amount that I'm running is much less than I ran in graduate school for a number of reasons. But to maintain and be close to your values, especially the values you have now, is not that hard. To maintain elite levels, that's difficult. It takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of effort, and maybe that doesn't happen for you. I know it's not happening for me. As I said, for a variety of reasons. One being time, and another one just being my body has broken down somewhat, so this wear and tear on my knees and my back and things like that. So those things come into play, but at least my VO2 is less, but it's not horrible. I wanted to put in some training adaptations associated with aerobic training. Some basic effects of aerobic training. For one, you have an increased left ventricular volume. So what? So the key is that leads to an increased stroke volume. So you're pumping out more blood per beat because the chamber within your left ventricle is bigger. That doesn't really happen with resistance exercise. With aerobic exercise, I don't list it, but the left ventricular chamber size increases as well as the thickness of the muscle. With resistance exercise, the thickness of the muscle increases, but the chamber size stays pretty much the same. So that leads to an increase in stroke volume. You also have increased parasympathetic stimulation, plus the increased parasympathetic stimulation causes your heart rate to be less at rest. But you couple the parasympathetic stimulation with the increased stroke volume, and that leads to a decreased heart rate at rest, as well as at absolute submaximal exercise intensity. So it's not looking at a percentage of VO2, 70% VO2 reserve before and after training. It's looking at a certain absolute value. So running at 5 miles per hour after training is going to be easier. and also you're going to see a decreased heart rate, a decreased RPE, so it's easier. Some of those things that it's easier, I think that's obvious. The decreased heart rate, I think you realize that as well. But knowing some level of exercise physiology to kind of couple it together and say, okay, this is why this is happening, I think is important. You also have an increased lactate ventilatory threshold. The ventilatory threshold looks at breathing rates, whereas lactate threshold looks at lactate rates. But they're both associated with the metabolic production of lactate. They're both looking at essentially the same thing. Those terms are basically interchangeable. As with many other things, there's a nuance difference that's going on there. But when you're talking to the general public, that people would use those things interchangeably, I think that's acceptable, and the concepts are basically fairly similar, especially from a performance perspective. So you can exercise at a higher percentage of your VO2. That's because your lactate threshold has increased, and you can run at a higher speed before you reach the threshold. So if you're looking at absolute intensities, you can exercise at higher absolute intensities as well. So the take home is exercise becomes easier. You also have an increase in VO2. So those two things are working together. You have an increase in the number and the size of the mitochondria, regardless of fiber type. So people with slow twitch muscle fibers, more slow twitch muscle fibers typically are better aerobically. But regardless of what you're doing, and this is where the strength training comes into play, that if you do strength training, a typical strength training workout, you're also going to be improving the aerobic aspect. You can do more sets, more reps before becoming fatigued. Some different mechanisms, but that increased size and number of mitochondria is also happening with resistance exercise. You also have that next one, increased enzymes to help metabolism. So with resistance exercise, you'll have increased enzymes associated with carbohydrate metabolism to a certain degree. But it's just a matter of what's happening more. So the specificity comes into play. If you're doing aerobic training, it's going to relate more to that aerobic type activity. If you're doing strength training, it's a little bit different. But some of the mechanisms are going to be overlapping. It's just the amount to which it's going to occur. And with aerobic training, if you do strength training, it'll help you a little bit aerobically. We see that with the sport, football, whatever, wrestling. But also, it's not going to be as much as if you did the standard aerobic training. You will also have an increase in capillary density, so that will mean that you can get more blood to the muscles. So now you have increased mitochondria, you have the increased ability to do aerobic metabolism, and then because you have an increased capillary density, you have the ability to get more blood to the muscles. You're able to get more oxygen to the muscles as well. So all those things are working together. From a hormonal metabolic perspective, diabetes perspective, we're increasing insulin sensitivity. Insulin levels, because you're exercising and using glucose and breaking down glycogen, your levels of insulin start to lower. They go down. But the insulin receptor numbers go up. So you're better able to use the insulin that you have. So that's a big benefit associated with exercise, that it improves that insulin sensitivity. There's other hormonal responses that are going on. I'm not going to go into those, but there's other things, X factors you could call them, that will help. And I'd also add the improved cognitive response to exercise, self-efficacy. You increase confidence in your ability to do exercise. A lot of people are scared. I know I always give the swimming example, that if I do a triathlon and you have an open water swim and you can't make it to the end of the race, you drown, you die. Now, in all honesty, when you do a triathlon, they have kayaks and things out there to help the individuals, and if you're in trouble, they'll you're not going to get stuck out there. But that was a big issue for me, and I think it's a big issue for a lot of people that if you're going to go for a bike ride, you're going to go for a run, that you're going to get to a point where you just have a real trouble getting back with aerobic exercise and with training in general, just training in general. It just increases your confidence. You know that you can do whatever it is that you're trying to do. You also have an idea, an increased knowledge of your limitations and ability. If I had to go out right now and run a 5K, I know I can do it. I ran on the treadmill. I run on the Riverwalk. When I run on the treadmill, I typically run more than 3 miles. When I run on the Riverwalk, time-wise, I don't know the distance, but the distance should also be above 3 miles. I know I can do that without any problem. Because I do those activities, I have the confidence. If you told me right now when I was in college, you asked me to do a bench press, I could have an idea of what weight I could do. I haven't done a bench press in a very long time. So right now, I wouldn't have that confidence with a bench press to know what weight was appropriate or how much weight I could do. But with exercise and with training, you get that confidence around those activities that you do, and that confidence is very important on multiple levels. And you'll see that with every level of training. You have that with cardiac patients; they're often very scared. You have that with pulmonary patients. The pulmonary patients are very debilitated. You do exercise in a controlled pulmonary rehab, cardiac rehab environment, they learn, oh, okay, I can walk this distance without any problem. I can go up steps, or how many steps can I go up before I run into trouble. They know these different things, and that gives them confidence. Without doing the training, you don't know what you can and what you cannot do, in addition to the various physiologic adaptations to training. So there's definitely a bit of a mental effect as well. So I'll make some final comments. Yay, final comments. Training will improve everyone's ability to exercise. Everyone will get better with training. Some people respond to training more than others. You have responders and non-responders, so not everybody's going to see the same results. You just see that in the weight room. You have people that have very strong legs and their legs just blow up. I have little chicken legs, and I tried to get them big, but it just didn't happen. For whatever reason, my bicep strength was very strong. I don't know quite why. My bench was not that great. We all have different abilities. Other people, their bench is great, and then their bicep strength is less. It's whatever. We were still all working out hard, but our body's responses to the training stimulus was different, and that's just the way it goes. So the responses and the adaptations will be different. Everybody will improve, but how you improve or the degree to which you improve is going to vary. Everyone will incur health benefits from being active. So no matter what you do, even if you have no results or you think you have no results, you will still have health benefits. And that's a big key. You have people that aren't seeing physiologic changes, and they're like, well, why should I do this? I could just sit on my butt and have no changes. Why would I work hard and see no results? But you do have results. You just don't see them, and that's improved health benefits. And trying to get people to buy into that is sometimes challenging, but you definitely have that as well. And also, I recommend that you do some sort of testing or some sort of health surveys. You should gear those health surveys to a certain extent to just see how well your program is working. But always, when you're doing a program and you're seeing that there's benefits associated with your exercise program, you want to highlight that and find that out. So one of the things you could do is just adjust the questions that you ask to try to use that. So an obese individual is not seeing results, but maybe their confidence is improving. So if you do exercise testing, you're not finding that improvement in confidence. But if you speak to them and you realize, hey, they're improving in confidence, then maybe in the future you ask questions initially, what's your level of confidence associated with exercise? They'll probably give you a low value. And then maybe after an amount of time, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, you ask them again, develop a survey, have them complete the survey. What's your level of confidence with exercise? And they'll probably give you a higher value. You're capturing that. You're capturing that. So if you're seeing things that you're observing and the types of things you're doing aren't capturing that, then just develop something to try to capture what you're seeing that's happening. And maybe things like strength and balance are improving even if weight and aerobic capacity aren't. So again, try to adjust things accordingly. So that's something that I would highly recommend with training. You want to have some sort of results that you can demonstrate and show the value of what you're doing. Okay, that's